the S2G podcast, where we share conversations that help us understand how to scale the food, agriculture, oceans, and energy transitions. I'm your host, Tanya Bakritzis. In this episode, we hear from Summit panelists and S2G Managing Director Frank O'Sullivan about what it will take to close the loop on clean energy. As a reminder, this content is for informational purposes only. It should not be taken as legal, business, tax, or investment advice, or be used to evaluate any investment or security, and is not directed at any investor or potential investor in any investment vehicle sponsored by S2G. Investing involves risk, including the risk of loss. Specific companies mentioned in this podcast are for educational purposes and should not be construed as an endorsement of any kind. Please note that S2G may maintain investments in some of the companies discussed on this podcast. For more important information, please see s2gventures.com/disclosures. The rapid growth of reshored manufacturing, AI data centers, industrial decarbonization, and electric vehicles are driving unprecedented demand for electricity. Many owners of these power-consuming assets have committed to net zero emissions targets, which will require them to transition to renewable power sources. But accessing this power is a challenge that extends beyond renewable developers. Many aspects of our broader energy system, from generation to transmission, PPA structuring, financial instruments, and regulation, will have to adapt to meet the growing demand for clean energy. In this episode, we're sharing a panel from our S2G Summit led by Frank O'Sullivan and featuring Ernest Moniz, former U.S. Secretary of Energy and current CEO and President of the EFI Foundation, Grant Van Rooyen, CEO of Tract, and Ben Pratt, President of Nova Clean Energy, about the challenges to realizing the clean energy transition across sectors. The conversation is packed with thought-provoking insights into the future of clean energy development from people who are on the ground playing critical roles in this effort. The panelists discuss whether the demand growth can be met, the biggest obstacles for energy developers, key geographical constraints for energy and server infrastructure, the importance of building trust with utilities, the effectiveness of regulated versus competitive energy markets, and so much more. I also spoke with Frank to get some of his framing for and reflections on the conversation. Bear with us, this is a longer episode, but the conversation touched on so many timely topics we felt it was important to release it in full. To kick things off, Frank introduced the panel by speaking about why addressing the gap in financing, or what we've been calling the missing middle, is key to realizing the energy transition.
So I think the scale of the opportunity has been apparent to private markets for quite a while. And we've seen this wave of private capital enter into the space with a view to obviously trying to profit and unlock value from it. The reality, though, is, and this is a difficult reality to acknowledge in some quarters, is that to date, the private markets have not done a good job at translating that capital into investable opportunities for the public markets. The graph here, it's an interesting graphic. It's just illustrating the committed capital, essentially capital that is sitting in publicly focused funds focused on sustainability transition in the United States and in Europe. It amounts to nearly $3 trillion. And juxtaposed to that is the scale of the current investable opportunity. This is the S&P Clean Energy Index, the totality of the enterprise value of that entire space. And there's $1.5 trillion delta between the money that's out there looking for things to do and the views today about what is investable and what that's worth. And this really is an indictment of the effectiveness of the private markets for delivering on transition. We here have been very interested in this particular problem for a long time.
Earlier this year, the energy team published a paper that compiled research into this missing middle issue.
And what the analysis basically revealed is that today's private markets are highly siloed with too much capital targeting earlier stage opportunities and a very significant deficit at the growth stage. I think that, broadly speaking, the markets are trying to begin to move towards rectifying. Structurally, it's difficult for the existing markets to flex to solve this problem in the nearer term. And then crucially, and I think this is very important, We are in a place today where solutions that are being pursued require transitioning across traditional sector seams that have not done business with each other previously. A lot of people speak a lot about the technical needs. I would posit that at least for the next 5 to 10 years, we have the technical solutions we need to make a lot of progress. What we don't yet have in many instances is a fit for purpose commercial model.
You can check out our paper that dives deeper into the missing middle on our website. But I asked Frank to share a bit more about what has led to this gap and why it is so important that we address it. You kick things off with talking about the missing middle, and that's a concept you've written a white paper about and something you've been discussing for a while now, really framing up the fact that we have the innovations and technological solutions to make significant progress over the next 5 to 10 years, but not really a capital model for this energy transition. Can you spend a minute just describing this gap in funding and what a more fit-for-purpose model might look like?
Yeah, absolutely. When people talk about the energy transition and so on, at times those discussions, they tend to be a little bit too kind of high level. Yes, we need to execute a transition in the system to drive towards cleaner and more sustainable energy systems. And then, of course, to allow those energy systems deliver for the broader economy. But then actually executing on that is not a trivial task, and it requires innovation and capital markets coupled to things like policy and market design to really help drive progress. And I think it's fair to say that for the past decade, at least, a lot of the focus has been on early stage innovation, the kind of gee whiz kind of solution space, which was and is still very important. And then at the other end of the spectrum, the deployment of very tangible, large-scale assets that kind of people can really see as major progress, like wind and solar at real scale. But interestingly, and I've learned this from like my lived experience, the people that tend to work on the earlier stage work, and indeed the people that finance that work, and the people that build and finance the very large-scale infrastructure type assets, they don't know each other at all. They never interact. And you can actually peel it back. The reason why they don't really interact is that their financial worlds don't intersect. And it's actually the real issue in delivering the transition, because what's actually enabled by today's capital markets focusing on clean energy is lots of capital to finance early stage innovation. That innovation comes with a very specific type of risk profile and so on, and return perception that's tailored to that particular investor class. And at the other end of the spectrum, another investor class who has candidly a lot more money to deploy and a much, much lower risk threshold. And they're not cross-pollinating. The innovations that are crucial for actually delivering the broader transition, not just wind and solar, but clean molecules, clean transportation solutions, clean everything, candidly. A lot of those solutions, they exist technically, but they haven't been adequately scaled commercially yet to become attractive and de-risked for the more traditional infrastructure investor. And the reason that that challenge exists is that there is very little money and capital focusing on investing in what I would describe as later stage innovation at the kind of true venture side that are maturing out, that have been technically de-risked, but still are commercially immature. Those kind of concepts, they need somebody to support them through a commercial maturing to the point where they can actually then be delivered at real scale by the infrastructure investors. So there's an extra set that needs to be inserted that bridges between the early stage investing and the late stage infrastructure world. Let's broadly categorize that as growth equity or growth capital, perhaps early growth if we wanted to be more precise. And that is a very underserved sector in kind of climate finance today. And the reason, candidly, Tanya, why it's so underserved is that serving it is complicated. Serving it is complicated because the risk profile and the return profile that you see at that growth stage is there's still some meaningful risk, and the nominal return profile is probably a factor of 3 or more less than what one would expect in a true venture portfolio. Some real risk, but a little bit less upside potentially. That's one factor. So that means the people with that earlier stage attitude are not really interested. At the other end of the spectrum, the very big infrastructure investors who one would expect should actually want to draw these ideas into their orbit. Their challenge is that the checks that these companies in that growth phase need, they actually tend to be too small. Those infrastructure guys, they like to write hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe more, per deal, check size. Whereas to properly support these growth companies, you may actually want to write a slightly smaller check. So let's say somewhere in the order of $50 to $100 million.
Yeah.
And there are just not that many funds out there that actually specialize in that particular space. Although I would argue it's perhaps the most important step right now in actually really delivering on the transition.
Creating capital markets that cater to these companies is one component of meeting the increase in clean energy demand. In his introduction to the panel, Frank laid out the drivers and scale of this demand growth.
We are seeing a period of profound excitement about the scale of growth in electricity demand over the next decade, driven by a view and a vision that industrial decarbonization is really going to begin to gain momentum. And that has been buttressed very substantially by the very rapid, near unexpected, I think, rise in expectations around data center and AI-driven demand. It's actually really staggering. In the last 2 years, expectations of electricity demand growth have more than doubled. So in 2022, the expectation was that US peak electricity demand would grow by about 20 gigawatts. In 2023, that expectation rose to more than 50 gigawatts. Between now and 2028, 5 years. It's a real challenge when you also think about the fact that there's an enormous amount of installations that are required just to maintain the existing deliverable capacity. And because we're moving more and more to renewables, there's a factor, again, because of the capacity factor involved. So for suppliers and for generators, that's a challenge. For people that are consuming that power, and we have, again, many folks in the room here today, both on the industrial decarbonization front and on the data center front and so on, who are wading into the space, they are now having to go to utilities and not ask for 10 megawatt interconnections, but maybe a gigawatt interconnection. And, that for some utilities represents a large portion of the entire utility. So how do you manage that type of issue? And most importantly of all, how do we actually move that power around the system? In the last 5 years, I'm going to give you guys a little quiz, actually. On average, how many miles of new transmission were installed in the United States? Was it 500? Was it 5,000? Or was it 25,000? What do you think? Per year in the total United States, new transmission capacity. All right, I'm going to go. Hands up for 25,000 miles. No. How about 500 miles? 500 miles. How about 5,000 miles? Yeah, it was 500 miles. Incredible, incredible. And this overarching story about immense demand growth, and by the way, a lot of that being clean energy demand growth, that's really exciting. But then that's juxtaposed with the tremendous challenge of actually executing on that.
This discussion was really timely, I think, talking through the increasing energy demands. Can you just spend a moment setting the stage for this conversation and why it was an important topic for you to address?
I felt it was really important that we address that topic at the summit because I actually see us, let's say, the collective energy space, energy sector, at this kind of really unique point in time. We're at a place today where clean energy has come to dominate electricity. Right? When people think about clean energy, actually, they're synonymizing energy with electricity. Mm-hmm. But electricity is really just about a quarter of the problem, actually, when we think about the climate challenge and carbon and so on. The other major consuming sectors in the economy, transportation, industrial processing, the built environment, they also account for enormous amounts of emissions. And what we need to do over the next decade, candidly, is we need to build upon the success of making clean electricity really work and really operate at scale and move those clean electrons into those other sectors. And doing so is an obvious thing in theory, but the reality, Tanya, is that making that happen faces all sorts of really meaningful barriers. A lot of them are commercial barriers, actually. A lot of them are regulatory barriers. And in order for us to succeed in really delivering that change, we have to take a much more holistic systems level approach to thinking about the opportunity set, thinking about creating solutions, and then going and trying to deliver them. As an example, one of the things we see a lot of today is a narrative around how clean electricity can now be used to perhaps manufacture clean molecules that could be used for low carbon fuels or cleaner fertilizers and so on. And that is absolutely true. And we have the technology today, actually. And with the supports that have come from the Inflation Reduction Act and so on in place, there is actually an economic envelope now where those solutions can actually compete in many instances with a more traditional polluting gray solution. However, the problem's not solved just because the tech works, or even in theory, the economics work, because the commercial models that are required to merge clean electricity into a business world where their off-taker is a commodity chemical manufacturer, those commercial models don't exist today. The business of making molecules is a short-run, spot market kind of business, a bit like we often hear people talking about what's the price of oil today. It varies day to day. And those businesses and the people that are in those businesses are very sensitive to short-run prices.
Yeah.
By contrast, the electricity business is really a long-term contracted business. People want to build wind farms or solar farms and contract them at a fixed price PPA for 15 or 20 years. And actually bringing the two of those paradigms together is difficult because the bankers that bank and finance clean electricity don't want short-run exposure and vice versa. And so what we're seeing now, even in our own portfolios, are opportunities where new commercial models can be gestated, but it's hard work, right? And somebody needs to step in and be in the vanguard of creating and experimenting candidly with what those models can be. We're very fortunate, I think, at S2G because of the partners we have, both upstream and downstream, and their willingness to work with us. Perhaps we step into the vanguard, we try and create those models, and then we help our partners leverage those. And that session that we had at Summit was very much about reflecting on that, learning from each other and from these different sectors, whilst all this time saying, hey, we need to be open-minded and creative. And in doing so, we can hopefully create new value streams and new opportunities over the next 5 to 10 years for our portfolio companies and for the capital we're deploying.
Now that we have some background on the need to meet the growing demand for clean energy, let's get into the panel.
So we'll begin with Secretary Ernest Moniz. Why don't you come on up, Ernie? Thanks very much. So Ernie was the 13th Secretary of Energy for the United States. Much more importantly, he was my boss for many years at MIT and survived. So very nice of you to be here, Ernie. Thank you. Ben Pratt is a former colleague of mine from Ørsted. Ben is now the president of Nova Clean Energy, happens to be one of our portfolio companies. And Nova is a large-scale utility wind, solar, and storage developer here in the United States. And Ben has also survived working with me. And then finally, a man who hasn't, for whom I haven't worked for, but Grant van Rooyen, who is the CEO of Tract. Tract is a fascinating organization, really delivering the future with respect to data centers at scale, very much in the vanguard of that transition. And Grant himself is an entrepreneur with a tremendous and amazing track record, really, in the entire data center space, was the founding CEO of Cologix and many more players before. So with that, we look forward to a discussion on this topic, and we'll get going. I'd like to start with you, Ernie. Can the challenge of delivering this power, this demand growth, can it be met, or what's the reality in your opinion? I know at EFI you guys are doing quite a bit of work on this at the moment.
I think the load growth, first of all, we have to understand has many components which are different temporally. Clearly, data centers and AI-driven data centers are a piece of it, but so is reshoring of manufacturing facilities, electrification of other sectors, EVs, heat pumps, some industrial processes. Just that in the near term, the order of 80% of the near-term load growth is looking to be in data centers, certainly in certain parts of the country. And it's looking very hard to supply the near-term load growth without a lot more gas. That's what everybody is basically proposing, and it's creating some excitement, let's say in the Southeast that I've looked at fairly closely. I think there's no doubt that there will be lots of growth, but I think the amount that's being talked about is often in the realm of uncertainty for various reasons. But we have not seen those other sectors really kick in yet.
Right.
And I think that if the utilities and the customers, the big tech companies, et cetera, plan now, and there's some of it going on for sure, I don't think the long-term load growth is going to be the issue. In fact, I think it will be a decarbonization opportunity. The real issue is the next 3 to 5 years, when people have been frankly caught flat-footed and don't have a lot of options.
Okay. Yes, I tend to personally feel that we won't see as much of this load growth. But as long as it's all coming from Grant's businesses, I'm quite happy. So, Grant, how do you, in your seat, running the business that Tract is all about, which is really at significant scale, how are you reflecting on, one, I guess, where you've come from, or where the entire data center space has come from with respect to its scale, its execution, and where it has to go going forward in terms of being able to deliver on these paper projections about demand growth?
First thing I have to say is I feel completely misled, because I thought I was being invited here to talk about World Cup rugby, but that's clearly not what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to pivot here and make it about data centers. I had to get that one in. If I'm going to work with Frank for a long time, I've got to get the shots in.
Again, I've always been put in my place, so that's fine. That's all right.
Maybe just a 30 seconds on what Tract is and how we'd like to be part of solving the challenge. I've been in it's now the digital infrastructure space this is my 28th year, but we've seen this step change in consumption now for a long period of time. And our job is to master plan the locations where this load is going to turn up at both the land and power level. Our industry has not done itself many favors by assuming that we can continue to operate in the spot market, turn up in a market, buy 50 acres of land, convince the utility to deliver 20, 50, 100 megawatts, and assume that game continues. It can't. Those easy electrons are gone. And equally as importantly, so too is there a shortage of industrial land in this country, period, full stop. And the building block of tomorrow for the data center use case is now really 1,000 acres and a gigawatt plus. And so that's what we're focused on. And what we find is that all of our partners, both the hyperscalers who build on these locations and the utility partners that are delivering those electrons, are very grateful to actually have their planning horizons thrown out 10 plus years. You can plan with a 10-year window. You can't plan with a 2 or 3 year window around this infrastructure. So we're currently deploying over $3 billion to own those parcels in the right locations, where over an extended period of time, we can engage in the horizontal development and pre-position not just roads, water, sewer, wet infrastructure, but also the utility infrastructure that can respond to that. By actually being able to point to a GPS location that says, this is where the load will be with predictable certainty, we think that's very helpful for the pull-through planning that's required across the board. I will say, relative to the debate of how steep is the curve, obviously we have a dog in the fight. Our view is that curve is more steeper than not. Our base case view for incremental electron consumption for the data center use case in the US over the next 10 years was 100 gigawatts. We now think that's closer to 150 gigawatts, and we could be wrong by a factor, depending on how ultimately training is architected and how inference takes hold within the current cloud infrastructure.
Ben, you are kind of stuck in the middle of this ultimately. running a development business, thinking about the near to medium term and where you're going to focus your development assets and development spend to build assets to meet this evolving demand. And Nova is an at-scale operation, across multiple technologies, multiple markets, etc. How do you guys look at today's market and kind of move your development agenda forward, given some of the constraints that Grant has mentioned?
Yeah, the load growth is something that's obviously exciting for a developer. We haven't seen load growth in quite a long time in the US, but these numbers that are getting thrown around, it's hard to see how they get met just because the grid is the issue. So we develop wind farms, and we started 2 developments, one in Minnesota, one in Texas in 2022, greenfielding, getting 10 to 20,000 acres of land, getting those projects ready to go into the queue. And one of them, the Texas project, can come online in late 26. The Minnesota project won't come online until probably 2029. And that's just purely a function of the ISO and the clog that's in the ISOs to get there.
An ISO, or an independent system operator, coordinates, controls, and monitors the operation of an electrical power system, usually within a single state, but sometimes encompassing multiple states.
And I think that's why one of the solutions that's going to get a lot of traction is, frankly, going to microgrid and going to rural areas. And I think a lot of these data centers now can maybe go, well, you can answer this question better than I can, but can go further afield. And that can help create a microgrid. But what do you do, at night, obviously, and what kind of, do you need green gas, and what do you do for the peaking? Those are all questions that have to be answered. But right now, the biggest issue for developers, hands down, is just interconnection.
Interconnection refers to the integration and linking of different power systems to allow for the transfer of electricity across regional or national boundaries. Interconnection enhances the reliability, efficiency, and stability of the power supply.
Can I just comment?
Yeah, please.
I think the interconnection issue is clearly very important on the grid side, but I would also single out cost allocation at the ISO RTO level. And going back to Grant's point, we think that the lack of serious longer-term planning greatly complicates the cost allocation issue, which then leads to further delay in getting all of this done. So this issue of longer-term planning, we like even 20 years better, but is really critical, and it's a hidden problem that is really impeding a lot of progress. But again, we should not think that building out the transmission is the only way to address the load growth. It'll be a mix.
You kicked off the panel addressing the question of whether this increasing demand for electricity can be met. And you touched on a few of the challenges. Some of what the panelists cited were interconnection and cost. I guess, how do you see those playing out in the near and longer term, or any other thoughts from you on what are the biggest challenges that need to be overcome?
Yeah, one of the problems that has really come to the fore over the past, let's say, 5 years is, of course, access to the grid. So the grid and the people that manage the grid, they're the gatekeepers to progress, candidly. Forever and a day, there have been processes, and they vary depending on which system you're looking to do business with, to bring your asset and get it approved for interconnection onto the grid. Those processes have tended to be pretty slow and mundane. And that was okay 10, 15, 20 years ago, perhaps. But now we're in a much more dynamic, a much more entrepreneurial environment where many more people are out there looking at opportunities that require grid connection and are therefore either saying, hey, we want to build new generation to supply demand, or we want to build new offtake either to support data centers or any of these kind of new power to X concepts. And people have seen how difficult it is to get projects permitted. And what's happened, to be honest, is like people have started squatting on the queue, the so-called queue for interconnection. So anybody with an idea will just say, I want a slot so that I can try and get on the system, because if I get approved, I suddenly have an incredibly valuable asset. And this expansion of the number of people that are just trying to get onto the system has meant that the processes that have previously been in place to assess and approve that have completely broken down. So there are systems in the US, in the Midwest, for example, at the moment, where the expectation is that it could take almost a decade to get a new interconnection for, let's say, a new wind farm approved. And when you juxtapose that with the fact that we probably have about a decade to really get our arms around the challenge of climate change, those two just don't impedance match. That's just not going to work. So we need to entirely reimagine that process, the interconnection process, the approval process.
Yeah.
And in fairness, people are realizing this and are working on it. So that's one item. The other item, candidly, that's really challenging is just the physical grid. Traditionally, you built your generation close to demand, and that was possible when you had kind of fossil fuel type power plants and so on. We still want to do as much of that as possible, but in reality, when you're moving towards a much more renewable-centric grid, you kind of have to build the renewables where they fit. And large-scale wind and large-scale solar, they do not fit into kind of small, kind of densely populated urban settings. They do fit in other parts of the country. But many of those parts of the country are not adequately served by things like transmission. So we need to build a whole lot more of it in order to get the power onto the grid and therefore to customers. And we also have to be realistic that, really expanding capacity will also take time. And so we need to step into doing more with the existing grid. Today, it's actually a pretty underutilized asset. And we've done this in our own portfolio with companies like Line Vision. We need to really push for shorter term optimizations so that we are squeezing every last drop out of the sponge that is today's grid through the use of things like grid enhancing technologies. And if we do all of that, then we stand a chance to support the growth in demand that's needed to really move the needle.
As Frank mentioned, we can't just put renewable energy generation anywhere. Oftentimes, the locations where renewables would be the most effective are places where there is less transmission infrastructure. To add on to these geographical complications, Grant shared some of the challenges to finding locations for energy-intensive projects, such as data centers.
Just to level set, if you don't mind, I hear often we can solve this by sending data centers to far-flung areas where it's easier, either electron easier, location of land easier. Let's just level set. We have two gigawatt projects, one in Reno and one we announced yesterday in Hanover County in Virginia on the 95 corridor. Each one of those projects is $25 to $30 billion per 2 gigawatts of concrete, steel, and mechanical electrical infrastructure, and then followed through with server infrastructure that the hyperscalers will deploy. And so this is massive construction to deliver 2 gigawatts across those buildings and that infrastructure. That's about 3,000 construction workers working every day for 10 years. You can't just put it in the middle of nowhere. This is not like West Australia where if you're digging copper out of the ground, you can fly people in and out and they'll tolerate it. It's not that. These are electrical craftsmen and women that are extraordinarily talented. There's not enough of them. This is moving millions of cubic yards of concrete, steel, etc. We've, as an industry, have gotten a little casual talking about just the magnitude here. A gigawatt was not in the vernacular a couple of years ago. Now we're throwing it around like it's candy. And so this is extraordinary, complex development that needs to have proximity to a workforce. But also these data centers are located for performance. I started my career building networks. We built the largest fiber network in the world going back. We started that 27 years ago. That was a $20 billion construction project, which we got done in around 4 years. At the time, it was the largest construction project of its kind in the world. We're now talking about each one of those in a single location simultaneously across 20 to 35 locations across 5 developers at any one point in time. And they can't just be anywhere. Someone asked me earlier at lunch today, why does performance matter? We'll go back to when websites were served up to us. Our tolerance factor for a slow loading website was pretty high. Now it's 0. Doesn't load, out, next one. It's the same for the interaction with this data. We have 0 tolerance for poor performance, and proximity matters relative to these workloads. So the circumstance where we're just going to find some place where we can plonk down 100 gigawatts or 10 or 20 and just leave it there, it's not going to happen. They're going to continue to grow and exist in a very distributed manner, very close to generally where we all live and work.
That's good to know.
Yeah, it is. Excellent.
Solve the transmission piece.
Also, I think it's worth maybe just taking a step back and understanding the stakes beyond those that have just been discussed. I don't think it's said often enough. We need to meet this demand growth. Geopolitical reasons, it is critical economically, security-wise, et cetera, that we build out that digital infrastructure, that AI infrastructure. So the idea of just delaying it should not be an acceptable option.
Grant brought up some really interesting perspectives from his viewpoint as someone who's really focusing on data centers to both of 2 points that you just raised. I think first, from his perspective of the project development of data centers, he's talked a bit about you just can't put these anywhere, right? There are big projects that required a highly skilled workforce, and really there's no tolerance for poor performance. So balancing that location with the workforce, with the scale of development. Can you talk a bit more about the considerations that go into the location of the projects versus the renewable energy build out?
Yes. If we let's start with the demand, and data centers are a great example of this. Data centers really have actually quite a specific locational need. Most of the large data centers are run and owned by the big hyperscaler tech companies and so on. And those companies actually run data infrastructure that actually relies on the physical proximity of other data centers in order to minimize things like latency in their systems, ensure security of their systems, and so on. And that means that you can't just plop a data center down wherever. There's actually a pretty predefined kind of footprint. And where we're moving to today is evolution of that footprint, because people realize we can't necessarily put more data centers or a whole lot more data centers into places like central Virginia, which have traditionally been the core of data center operations in the US. But it's still going to lead to a relatively concentrated build out of capacity. And for those new areas where that build out is going to take place, we're going to have to bring very substantial additional grid capability and capacity to the table. And those grids are going to have to also be able to source and deliver clean power relatively effectively to those regions. So that in its own right is going to shape where the renewable development is going to take place. So there's this increasingly complex matrix of solutions that are needed in order to define what looks good and what checks all the boxes, whether it's the performance of the digital asset or how carbon intensive or otherwise its powering is going to look like. So all of that is taking place and people are trying to figure all of that out. And then on top of that, and Grant mentioned this, and I find it fascinating whenever he does speak about it, people often don't realize like that if you're building a 500 megawatt data center, 500 megawatts is the amount of electricity a big city uses on a kind of go around the clock basis, hundreds of thousands of people's worth. So the scale of that facility is actually difficult to comprehend. And it takes thousands and thousands of craftspeople to build these facilities. It takes an incredible amount of material to build these facilities, etc. And so the solving of this kind of multidimensional puzzle in ensuring that you have the resources to deliver what you're looking to deliver in terms of that facility, that asset, whilst at the same time integrating it into a grid system that is candidly creaking at the seams is a great challenge. Lots of people are out there trying to address it today. Grant and the team at Tract is obviously looking to do that better than everybody else. That's their mission. But that's going to be the key to unlocking value from the emergence of AI and so on, whilst at the same time ensuring that can be done sustainably.
There are many factors to consider when choosing a location for a project like a data center. One of which is there has to be sufficient energy generation nearby. Working with local utilities is also a critical part of the equation.
Grant, and we'll more broadly explore this, but maybe to begin with you, when you bring a proposal of that scale to a utility, I imagine there are different reactions in different utilities. Do you see a proactiveness that utilities are recognizing now that this is a huge opportunity for their business and are willing to get creative with you? You're bringing a different paradigm to them in reality. And how have they been reacting to that?
Yeah, look, I'd say the first thing is we're pretty thick-skinned.
You are.
If you have to be, culturally I am, but not least of all, go and raise $3 billion in the last 2 years of really high interest rates and inflation, and you're going to hold a non-cash flowing asset for 10 to 15 years, and you ask people for their money, you're going to develop an even thicker skin. So having crossed that threshold, the first thing that is just critical here is to actually recognize that nobody prepared for this. These systems were not designed for this. The communities that this infrastructure lives in were not prepared for it, and most of them don't understand it, including many of the utilities. So our first port of call is to explain. We have to explain why we want to plan at the gigawatt level, why we need 1,000 acres, why we can't put it in the middle of nowhere. The second threshold of explanation is actually how data centers are beyond entwined in our everyday existence. That we've taken 25,000 acres through zoning and entitlement in the United States in the last 2 years. And each one of those acres was never an industrial acre. We had to manufacture those acres. And so we've sat in hundreds of community meetings to educate people and many utility engagements to educate. And so I think it's critical to tie the relationship together. Specifically with the utility companies, I think it is incredibly important that you put it into context and then you give them a plan. If you walk in and just say, we want 2 gigawatts, and the question is when, without a load ramp, that should be a short meeting. We should get kicked out. And so investing ourselves with them in their planning is critical. And the education piece, if you walk in obnoxious, before you've educated, it's really tough. But it's going to take a long time. And it's not enough. They should be conservative and test our use case, which is why private capital is going to solve this, at least I wouldn't say in the short term. Our view is that's a 15 plus year capital deployment opportunity, but it's going to take all of that mix to deliver on it.
One of the things I thought was interesting is the dynamic between the projects he's looking to build and the collaboration with the utilities to service that need, right? So how do you see that relationship between data centers and other energy-intensive project developers and the utilities evolving?
Yeah. I think that we're at a kind of an unstable equilibrium in some respects around a lot of that today. And what I mean by that is that there is a tremendous amount of potential for progress in everything that we're speaking about. With that said, there are some real risks because the scale involved is very substantial. And utilities are sitting right in the middle of this. They are inherently conservative organizations. Their mandate is to keep the lights on. Keep your lights on, keep the hospital's lights on, etc. And so they are trying to balance a tension here between this kind of amazing, albeit potentially over the horizon opportunity and what it's going to take in order to make that realizable. And at the same time, ensuring that they don't find themselves engaged in some folly that doesn't materialize and becomes a very expensive mistake for them. And so when you look around at people that are trying to get into this business, some are pretty blasé, a kind of more cowboy attitude, saying, hey, we're going to go do this. And like the utilities are actually a problem. They're not acquiescing to our needs. We need a different model. Others have a more nuanced understanding of just the realities of what the utilities can do and how they can do it. And what they can do is really impressive. What they already do is incredible. And I have every confidence that the US utility sector can continue to evolve and really support and drive this evolution. But we need to also be realistic to their particular needs and sensitivities. And so what Grant says is, how do we work with these people? We build trust. We bring projects in a manner that resonates with how the utilities think about their own assets, their own projects. It allows the utility to build confidence in their new partners and ultimately to scale in partnership. And that approach really bears fruit. That's his view. That's certainly, I think, our view on the energy side of the house at S2G. We've seen the most successful people out there who are looking to drive this change, they do so by understanding the levers that they need to be able to pull and how to pull them, and working with the utilities in a way that works for them is probably one of the most important of all of those.
Ernie shared a different perspective from his experience working with utilities.
I think actually the utilities in this case, I would argue, are trying to respond pretty quickly. In the Southern case, for example, Georgia Power, it was only a few months from request to the regulators to approval of an unanticipated 1.6 gigawatts of natural gas assets to be put in place in the next 2 to 3 years. They are difficult. They're slow to move. And we can argue, by the way, whether the regulated parts of the country or the competitive markets are a better place. I have my answer, but
What is that answer? You think it's the regulated?
Regulated, I think, is.
Let me maybe ask Ben.
superior.
So, Ben, for your business, you can obviously operate in different regulated markets.
Yep.
Which markets do you guys find most interesting at this stage?
Well, I think I wouldn't disagree. I mean, I think it's flipped. Just because of speed to market, you can make the argument that you will get to market quicker in a regulated market, which I never would have said a couple of years ago.
But part of it also is, and I think it's more broadly important, that there are big also regional differences in capacity. Like everybody knows the Southeast is not exactly wind heaven, right? I think we need a little bit more sophistication in how regulation and geography and all these other things converge. But we have to meet the load growth, because ultimately this is a pathway to the economic benefits, to the security benefits, et cetera, et cetera.
We were very honored to have Professor Ernest Moniz join us on the panel. And there was a really interesting discussion that you teed up around regulated versus competitive energy markets and which is more effective. The consensus seemed to be that at this moment, regulated markets are more compelling. Curious why that is and what you think might tip the balance.
Yeah. So it's a fascinating question, Tanya. This topic has been debated for literally decades now in the US and around the world. How should we mesh something that is inherently a machine, the electrical system, from one end to the other? It is actually a unified machine. How do we mesh that together with economic and market models that ensure the most cost-effective delivery of the utility service? And in the United States, of course, we've chosen all of the paths. And what that means is that in some parts of the country, in about 2/3 of the load in the United States today is served by what are known as restructured power markets. And in restructured power markets, generation is a separated business from the delivery of power to the customer. So you can be an independent power producer, you own a power plant, and your business is simply selling electricity onto what we would call the market or the grid. And then downstream, there is a supply business or a regulated wires business, which is basically the utility that you and I think about. They supply the power to your house, they send you your bill, and so on. They don't really engage in the electricity, in the production of the power. They're just a kind of wires and pipes type business, and they charge you a toll for using their system. Mm-hmm. So that's the deregulated or the open market kind of concept. And the view there was a more efficient way of getting the right balance of generating assets on your system. And in doing so, you don't overburden the customers with the cost of having to, for example, pay for power plants that weren't absolutely necessary.
Right.
That was the theory, and we've played that out, and it works okay. But in other parts of the country, we don't have that system at all. We have what's called a vertically integrated power system, which means that the utility that serves you at your house and owns your meter, they own everything from that meter right the way up to the power station. And they run everything in a kind of singular manner. Now, there is a very interesting question about which model is best for supporting the energy transition. And one of the reasons why there is a debate about this is that in tomorrow's energy system, coordination of variable resources like wind and solar, whilst at the same time ensuring reliability in power delivery and so on, that becomes much more complicated. And the restructured power market has many different players providing generation, etc. By contrast, If you have a vertically integrated system, you just have one boss that manages everything.
Yeah.
So understands what the forecasts are looking like. If there's going to be less wind, we'll have one of its dispatchable power plants up and running, ready to fill in,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera. And there's an ongoing debate, candidly, right now, which I think we're going to see playing out over the next few years, as to whether or not that system can actually be more cost effective at delivering a renewable-centric system than the restructured system. We shall see. My own personal perspective, if anybody's interested in this, is that I actually do see merits in the vertically integrated system because of the technical challenges of running very high level renewable. But there is always this risk that the vertically integrated model leads to excess rent capture, as the economists like to say, by the utilities. And so how you cater for that or how you manage that is through more effective regulation.
Yeah.
And that in its own right is a complex science. But we here in the US today, we're running this experiment, and we're going to, I'm sure over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to figure out which model actually does make more sense.
Another consideration when designing clean energy systems is understanding what customers are looking for.
So we talk about like load growth in an absolute sense, but there's an appetite at least for it to be as clean as possible. Certainly a lot of the hyperscalers want to lean in that respect.
The customers.
Customers, of course. And then with respect to industrial load growth or industrial decarbonization, it almost all has to be clean to qualify for tax credits, et cetera, et cetera. How does that build an outlook for you, Ben, for example, as you guys are looking at your customer base, which is ultimately a kind of a similar customer base to yours, Grant? What are those big buyers saying about what they want, how they're thinking about their procurement? I'm just curious what you're seeing with respect to all of this.
Yeah, I'd say that, again, it's all regional.
Yeah.
When you look at something like green gas initiatives in Japan, it has a massive influence on the ERCOT market.
ERCOT manages about 90% of the electrical load in Texas.
Because a lot of that is planned for East Texas, for example. And some of the numbers you hear just on, that's not even incumbent domestic load growth, right? That's to serve a country that has a pretty aggressive initiative to go to green gas fired turbines. But they need hourly matching to do that based on the IRA guidance. So the only solution to that right now is, you don't have enough battery duration. So you need more wind. It's just as simple as that. So that's why, we've seen a pretty big jump in PPA values in general.
PPA is a purchase power agreement or a contractual agreement between energy buyers and sellers.
And just look, a Texas PPA in 2017, those were going for $15 for wind. Now they're pushing $50. So, this is, again, why I think we will see a lot more aggressive wind development generally, especially in areas that, like Texas and the desert Southwest, and the need of transmission, just because the more solar penetration you have in a market, the greater the duck curve gets.
Yeah.
When the sun sets, it's just a problem everywhere. And that happened way faster than I expected in Texas. I did not expect it to be this dramatic, this fast, if you asked me a few years ago. But also now we have to start looking at areas that maybe have a much lower wind resource that wouldn't have looked attractive in the past, but you have PPA values that are high enough now that make it work. But that can be a tough sell at times. And it can be also, you're getting squeezed on the data center side of where you put these. It's the same thing on wind development side, because the low-hanging fruit's gone. You have to really get a bit creative.
Grant, as you think about your customers or subsequent customers, you're not directly in the business of procuring power, but there is this challenge of making sure that it can get there ultimately. How do you guys think about that at the moment?
Yeah, maybe one asterisk there, which is we're in the business of delivering power to site. We won't be the end customer that's paying that. Maybe just to level set, you're consuming a gigawatt and a half of electrons in a single data center. Call that 9 cent a kilowatt hour power. That's $1.5 billion a year of a power bill. These are adult costs.
Yeah.
Just to put it into perspective. The other observation I make is the end user customers here have made promises around net zero and their commitment to green power that are not suggestions. Those are promises, and they mean them. And they're spending adult money to deliver on them. However, they also are for-profit entities, and what is most important to them is to receive those electrons and put them into service. And that is also a non-negotiable outcome, to Ernie's point. And the locations are not actually as flexible as we'd all like to think, as I said earlier. The other final thing I'll say is a data center is actually exactly like a submarine. When you turn it on, you cannot turn it off. On is good, off is bad. And so we don't have the ability to toggle the use case off. Now, training is a separate example there. That's going to have a whole nother set of issues. We don't think training engines are just going to be turned off, but the magnitude of oscillation and the impact that's going to have on the grid is the issue. The data center use case for everything other than crypto is far less flexible than folks would like. And when you turn it on, you cannot turn it off.
We had time for a few questions at the end. The first was around the scale of electrifying other sectors, such as transportation.
Okay, I mentioned electrification of other sectors more broadly, but maybe it's worth just giving a scale. Today in the United States, it's not green, it's gray, but today we use about 10 million tons of hydrogen. So that's 10 to the 10th kilograms of hydrogen. You can lower this somewhat, but for round numbers, let's say 50 kilowatt hours of electricity per kilogram. You just multiply, and with today's hydrogen use, if it were green, to give you a scale, that is 1/8 of today's electricity production. If we multiply that by a factor of 10 for the future, let's say green hydrogen economy, let's be super optimistic, obviously you've exceeded today's entire electricity supply. And so it's only to say that using green hydrogen as an example of potentially penetrating into multiple sectors, we are talking about a big set of requirements on the electricity sector. But again, we should think of that as an opportunity given the options we have in the electricity sector.
The next question was around energy storage, such as batteries, what the concerns are, and what technologies panelists are excited about in that sector.
Yeah, I think historically it was all about co-locating a battery with a solar farm and charging from that the credits that you needed. The IRA did away with that, which is, I think, a positive thing because now the industry is looking at it more from a standalone basis. So you're getting much more aggressive battery development going on. A lot of companies are building these fully merchant on balance sheet, which is not a bad thing because it gets that onto the grid. And you look at a system like ERCOT where in Texas, so much of the value of the day is just 2 hours of the day. It's just that simple. The sun sets and the market blows out pretty much every single day now. But if you build enough battery, that will take care of it. However, there's 100,000 megawatts in the queue at ERCOT for solar and there's 100,000 for storage. And right. Solar will win that battle as far as outpacing batteries. So doesn't seem that's going to go away anytime soon. I would say that battery cost is coming down pretty quickly right now, but I haven't seen a lot on the advancement of duration, beyond the 4 hour. But there is the concept now you're getting to price levels that are so high. Like I was mentioning, in the future, does a solar farm with four-hour batteries next to it, whatever it takes, does that beat the economics of wind, if you know what I mean? So I think that the duration in batteries is just going to be the key technology going forward, for sure, in my opinion. Yeah.
I think there's another dynamic that, again, is not talked about enough, and that is, in my view, and I'm all for building out hundreds of gigawatts of solar and wind by 2030, but we've got to be honest that we are still going to need a huge amount of backup capacity. And I think somebody named Frank O'Sullivan, when he was at MIT, did things like looking at hour by hour dispatch of wind, for example, in Texas and California. And in both cases, let's say Texas in particular for wind, great wind, except for 90 days a year. And so, again, it's this planning systems level.
Yeah.
And we have to stop kidding ourselves in terms of what we're going to need in terms of an enormous backup system.
We've talked a lot about the generation. We've talked about the large projects consuming all this demand. But what about batteries? How does that fit into the load balancing equation? And where do you see that sort of playing out?
I think that sometimes when people think about the grid, Tanya, they tend to go to the extremes, to the bookends. On one hand, you have this perfectly dispatchable system so that literally every time somebody flicks on a switch, generation is modulated perfectly to meet that demand precisely. And then at the other hand, you've got this kind of roulette table where is the wind going to blow? Will the sun shine as strongly? Will there be enough power on the grid? And the reality, of course, is that power systems are actually a combination of those things and are increasingly a combination of those things. But there's no question that having the ability to store electricity over short, medium, and long periods of time does provide greater flexibility in bringing more of these renewable intermittent resources onto your systems. And so what we're seeing today is a world where the renewable generation, the intermittent generation, is very cost effective, but it lacks the dispatchability. And so as its role in aggregate grows onto systems, system operators are saying we now need to bring in some mechanism for backing that up, for buffering that.
Right.
And so we're seeing tremendous growth in storage, and the combination of storage plus renewables is more cost effective in many instances than just having a dispatchable power system. And of course, it allows you a pathway to a very green system, a very clean system as well. There is, though, no silver bullet. So I think where we're at today is a world where we have pretty cost-effective storage for intraday variability, relatively short-run 3, 4, 5-hour variations in production, and batteries that can match that at a reasonable price point. But as we move to much more renewable kind of centric systems, that intraday variability is going to be complicated further by interday variability and then intra-weekly and monthly variability. And so we're going to have to power systems that add more nominal storage than exists today. Now, that storage may not be in the form of batteries purely. The classic storage concept, by the way, in power systems is pumped hydro or hydro in general. A dam is the perfect battery, actually, for power systems and has been for 100 years. But it's difficult to build new dams, and new hydro projects are very rare. But we are going to have to find new ways of creating low carbon storage. Some of it will inevitably be electrochemical, but some of it might be in the form of things like molecules. You might see things like hydrogen begin to play a role. So when you have excess electricity, you can produce a molecule like hydrogen. In some areas that can be stored, although I have to caution, it's expensive. And then that could be burned just like natural gas, but burned in a turbine in a manner that's entirely carbon-free. There are other solutions in different systems that can provide similar responsiveness, including, by the way, demand response. So we have just smarter consuming systems where we consume less when there's less power available. There are limits to that too. But we're beginning to see systems flex, and we have now a lot of the technology that's needed to help us through the next decade, at least, of change in a way that allows us to continue to take carbon off the grid whilst continuing to maintain reliable systems. Soon enough, though, we're going to run into a point where that may begin to become expensive again, relatively speaking. And at the summit, we had, of course, a question or some discussion about, is there therefore a role for advanced nuclear? Is a controversial topic for some. From my own personal point of view, I think it's an important technical option to have. It is zero carbon, essentially. It is fully dispatchable. It is very energy dense. You can do a lot with it. It's not for everywhere, but I think in truly ultra low carbon power systems, and we're going to have to get there, maybe not this decade, but in future decades, and certainly within my kids' lifetime, nuclear has an important role to play there.
Like Frank mentioned, the last question to the panel was about the potential to revitalize the nuclear industry in the U.S.
There's no doubt we've been now through a period of really couple of decades of a level of innovation in nuclear that has never been seen before, really. And yet it has produced next to nothing in terms of deployment. I think we're not really technology limited in terms of both generation 3+ and generation 4 reactors. I think we are very limited in terms of how risk is managed in order to attract investment. We're simply going to have different mechanisms of, I think, public-private risk sharing. But I think that's what's needed. And I'll just end on that.
Thank you guys so much. That was fantastic. Really appreciate it.
Good, thank you. Cheers, yeah, likewise.
Any further reflections you might have from the panel that we didn't cover today?
I think what I've found really interesting and perhaps quite heartening from both panels, Tanya, was that there wasn't a tension between should we be doing something or should we not. And by the way, we had a lot of very pragmatic people in the room. Certainly in our energy business, we take a pragmatic approach to the realities of how difficult it is to continue to deliver on our energy needs, whilst at the same time facing up to the climate and the carbon challenges. And what I think is interesting is that I think attitudes are changing. People are no longer asking, should we be doing something?
Right.
There's a near universal consensus, certainly amongst thoughtful folk out there, that action is absolutely required. Now the focus is shifting towards what are the challenges? How can we think about creative solutions to overcoming those challenges? And doing so, not with a kind of religious fervor that there is only one creed, this is how it must be done, but doing so with a thoughtful, fit for purpose, systems level approach that delivers the right solution for the right context. And everybody in the room, whether it was people delivering generation, whether it's people thinking about the grid, whether it's people consuming that power, whether it's the people financing all of that, everybody in the room was bringing that attitude to the table. And I thought it was quite uplifting to see that. And I certainly walked away feeling, again, grounded in the scale of the challenge, but also enthused by how the collective community has rallied around this, seized the opportunity, and is now focused on going after it.
Amazing. I think that's a perfect place to end. Thank you so much, Frank. I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us today. Thank you for tuning in to the S2G podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review, or share it with a friend. For more information or to connect with us, check out s2gventures.com.